recently. He knows what he wants, and he has been quite consistent in pursuing those goals. You know, what I would say about President Obama is there are many foreign policy challenges that he has to face. It's the withdrawal from Afghanistan, it's the war in Syria, it's primarily at the moment negotiating this deal with Iran to forestall any use of military force in Iran. So he has certainly many challenges. I also think that he has been so disillusioned with the relationship with Russia since President Putin came back. When President Medvedev was in office, the U.S.-Russian relationship was much better. The low point before Ukraine was the granting of temporary political asylum to Edward Snowden, and that has been a huge blow to the U.S.-Russian relationship from the U.S. point of view. So I think his instinct was to withdraw from that relationship, to put that on hold and focus on other things. But the problem is that's not what President Putin's been doing. So Putin has been very much focused on all of these issues that are of core interest to him, like Ukraine. The U.S., really until the revolution broke out in November, was largely absent from Ukraine. The Europeans were the ones that were engaged with Ukraine. So I think it's a different level of interest and a different level of focus. And so inevitably you get Russia much more present and more successful from its point of view.
In which category does Edward Snowden falls in? Was a provocation?
I mean, Edward Snowden falls in the category. I mean, there's still things that we don't know about exactly how he landed in Moscow and how much contact he had with the Russians beforehand. And there's debate about this, so we don't know all the facts there. But from the U.S. point of view, this was obviously a disaster because, first of all, of the material that was leaked about what the National Security Agency was doing in the United States, and then what it was doing to our allies. So Putin, in a funny way, has accomplished, knowingly or not, what the Soviet Union was never able to do, which is to drive these deep wedges between the U.S. and its allies, and particularly between the United States and Germany, which, you know, where the relationship has also tanked. Now, obviously, we're working with Germany in the Ukrainian situation. So I think it's quite possible that President Putin really does believe that the United States is out to get Russia, that it's trying to overthrow his regime, that it's acting against him. If he believes that, then the Edward Snowden case was a way of saying, look, you know, we can retaliate against you and we can challenge you on your narrative.
In Syria, even though you have the Soviet fleet at Tartus, nobody anywhere in the Kremlin can ignore the brutality of the Assad regime. Russia and the United States work together for the removal of the chemical weapons, but Russia keeps on giving conventional weapons by the plane load to Assad, who is apparently having success against the insurgency. What is the game?
I think the Russian game there is, and they've always, I think, assumed that President Assad would prevail, and they're trying to help him prevail by providing him with the arms. They want to have a strong secular regime in Syria. What Russia fears is the coming to power of groups that would be infiltrated by Islamists, and that's not only a danger regionally, it's a danger in Russia itself. Because of Chechnya, and not only Chechnya, the whole of the North Caucasus is a tinderbox. There's an insurgency going on there. So the bottom line is to have a secular strongman in power in Syria. And even though we see this humanitarian catastrophe there, apparently from the Russian point of view, it's more important to keep him in power or someone like him. I mean, the Russians say, we're not particularly wedded to him, but at the moment, this is the legitimate government. That's the bottom line for them, and not to have a government. And of course, we know that the opposition in Syria has become more radicalized. There are al-Qaeda elements there, to make sure that no people like that come to power, because that is seen as a direct threat to Russian interests.
If Angela Stent can see this, and Angela Stent can see as well that the United States, one of the priorities of the United States is radical Islam. Why can't the two governments say, well, we have a common objective here? Why can't they?
Well, that's an excellent question, because you're quite right that ultimately we have the same goals in Syria. I mean, neither of us want to see a radical government coming to power. I think the problem is, how do you get there? And the U.S. has been willing, I mean, the Geneva talks now, of course, have broken down, but the U.S. has been willing to include different opposition groups in these talks about what happens after Assad. The Russians have been more wary of this, and the U.S. has still said, until recently, that a precondition for resolving this issue is that Assad has to agree to step down. So it's how you get there that is problematic, and that's where it ties into Russia's sense of its privileged relationship with the current Syrian government, and with not trusting the United States to agree to a government that wouldn't ultimately threaten Russian interests. So it's how you get there, it's not the ultimate goal.
I would like to go back to the mistrust point that you just raised, but first let me just ask about Iran. Mm-hmm. In the geopolitical game or view of Moscow, is the elimination of the possibility of a nuclear arsenal in Iran what they want, or not really?
Well, I would say Iran is another area where ultimately we and the Russians share the same goal. We do not want Iran to be a state that has nuclear weapons. On the other hand, I would say that, the Russians, at least officially, say that they don't think Iran is nearly as close to producing a nuclear weapon as the U.S. and the West says it is. And also, in some ways, I believe that the Russians they don't fully believe that the Iranians would actually do that. But then you have another set of Russians who will say, we have to accept a nuclear Iran. We accepted a nuclear India and Pakistan. We didn't want that, but we have to accept it. So even though I think both of us don't want a nuclear weapons armed Iran, the Russians are more willing to contemplate accepting it. And you can see already, as we move towards a possible solution with Iran, Russia obviously wants to ramp down the sanctions because it's been affected by the tougher sanctions, although it did agree to tougher sanctions in 2010 with the U.S. Mm-hmm. And the Russians are now saying, if we have an agreement with Iran, why does the United States need a missile defense program where it deploys components near Russia? Because if Iran isn't going to have nuclear weapons, then the U.S. doesn't need a missile defense program, maybe against North Korea, but then why deploy things in Eastern Europe? So, there are aspects to a possible settlement that would also could cause more U.S.-Russian tensions.
Is there a fix?
I think the only fix would be if the U.S. and its allies in Europe were willing to go some way towards recognizing Russia's interests. Now, of course, President Obama has said that in the last few days. We recognize that Russia has interests in Crimea, in Ukraine, and we respect them. We need to work together. I think it would probably also mean, not having a more consistent policy in supporting these different opposition groups in Ukraine. I mean, the Russians have complained that the people in the Maidan are all fascists and terrorists. That's clearly not true. But there are nationalist and extreme right-wing groups in the Maidan, and I think the U.S. has to be quite clear that these are groups also that we don't support, that we support more mainstream groups that would like to have, say, a government in Kiev that's more middle of the road. At the moment, it's a very fluid situation, but I think the ultimate solution to this has to be recognizing Russia's interest. The problem is what that will ultimately mean is that the U.S. and the Europeans will not see the kind of Europe whole and free that they've been talking about for a long time. And countries like Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine will have these unresolved territorial issues that probably won't be resolved for a very long time.
During the Cold War, there were incidents and there was the clear possibility of a nuclear confrontation. There were regions of the world to be disputed. Now, whimsically, things seems to be a question of Russia wanting a little more respect. Is that it?
The respect is certainly part of it. I mean, I think that the Russians feel, or particularly the Kremlin feels, that since President Putin came to power, and even when he was prime minister for those 4 years, Russia has restored its economy. It used to have 7% per annum growth rates until the financial crisis hit. It's a player again in the world. It's a nuclear superpower. It remains the other nuclear superpower. It's an energy superpower, maybe somewhat less so now with the discovery of unconventional gas and things like that, but it still has major resources. It has a veto in the United Nations Security Council, and it wants to have the respect that it had when it was the Soviet Union, even it. And the question then is, how do you define the respect? And I think, again, some of the European countries are more willing to say, of course we respect Russia's special interests, and we respect it as a country. The U.S. maybe hasn't been as willing to say that, but in the U.S. we're divided over this too, because we have very strong groups, not only in the Congress, but outside of the Congress, that are very much pushing on the issues of human rights in Russia. Recently, the whole question of LGBT rights has become controversial because of the Russian legislation. So within the U.S., the question for us is, to what extent can we go towards respecting Russia? And we do respect Russia, but how do we deal with our own groups who say, we're a democracy and we stand for human rights and LGBT rights, and we have to criticize Russia for this? So this is the debate that we have within this country, and in the 22 years that are covered in my book, certainly, we haven't been able to resolve. And the relationship is probably as bad as it's been since the collapse of the Soviet Union, certainly as bad as it's been since the Russia-Georgia War.
However, and finally, Second World War, Cold War, the crisis at the moment in Ukraine, we've never seen the United States and Russia fighting against each other. Is that it, or are we going to see it?
No. I mean, the U.S. and Russia aren't going to fight each other. We're not going to get into any kind of military conflict with Russia over what's happening in Ukraine. And we will continue to work with Russia, as we must, on the Iranian issue, on the Syrian issue, on other issues in the Middle East. So it's a limited partnership. It has severe limits. But on some multilateral issues, we are fated, and we will continue to work with Russia because between the two of us, we have the ability to affect outcomes, particularly in the Middle East.
What about China in this equation?
So China, obviously, as the rising power, the Chinese-Russian relationship is much better than it's ever been, partly because they're both working together to ensure that the United States isn't the unilateral hegemon, and the Russian-Chinese relationship is better than it's ever been, as I said. But the Chinese have a very clear-eyed view of their relationship with Russia. Russia is an important raw material supplier to China, energy supplier to China. They support each other on global issues such as the importance of a multipolar world. Russia supports China on issues like Tibet, Taiwan, and those issues. But the Chinese also look at the Russian economy, and they look at the way that the Russian political system is organized, and they're very cold-minded about that. They have a very clear view of that. And in the longer run, there's a question of the Russian Far East. It's being depopulated. Russia faces a demographic crisis anyway, but particularly in its Far East. The Chinese are very active in the Russian Far East economically. And so in the longer run, there's a question of what happens in that relationship. Should the Russians be concerned? But at the moment, you don't hear that. Now, of course, the U.S.-Chinese relationship is also very important for the U.S. $500 billion of trade with China, as opposed to the $40 billion with Russia, I might add. And so it's a sort of a three-sided game. It was like that during the Cold War, too. But, of course, the dimensions have changed. But both the U.S. and Russia are going to have to deal with a rising China and questions about China's future military posture.
Because, you see, a boxing match, is pretty easy to understand.
Yeah.
But a boxing match with 3 people in the ring, it's a much, much more complex game.
It's more complex. And interestingly, both the U.S. and Russia have sort of announced pivots to Asia. We're all trying to diversify, both countries, our relationships with Asia, in a sense, to make sure that we have other options as we see China rising. So theoretically, Asia should be, and China should be, an issue where the U.S. and Russia can talk to each other, talk about our common interests. But we're not there yet, given all these other crises.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.